I already covered the 2023 holiday special of the CREEPSHOW Comics revival, but I still hadn't covered the original CREEPSHOW comic that came out. So that's what I'm doing right now. Let's take a look at that adaptation of the original film. In the first story, called Father's Day, Sylvia, her nephew Richard, niece Cass, and Cass's husband Hank gather for an annual dinner, and they decide to tell Hank about Great Aunt Bedelia, who years ago, after years of abuse, snapped and killed her father with an ashtray. Back in the present day, an older Bedelia arrives at the gathering but stops by the family cemetery first. Unfortunately for her, her father suddenly crawls out of his grave and strangles her before going and killing the nephew with a gravestone and turning Sylvia's head completely around. But that's where the story ends in the comic, whereas it continues in the film for a little bit. The second story is called The Lonesome Death of Geordie Verrill, where after a meteorite lands and a small town yokel named Geordie finds it, he decides to try and sell it. But first, he accidentally cracks it open by pouring water on it, releasing fluid from inside. After touching the fluid, alien grass starts growing on parts of his body, and every time he tries to wash it off with water, it spreads. Eventually, it covers Geordie's whole body, and he decides to end himself with a shotgun. In the third story, called The Crate, a janitor named Mark works at a university when one day he discovers a mysterious crate behind a grate under some stairs. So he calls a Professor Stanley, who comes and helps Mark retrieve the crate. Once they get it open enough, though, Mark reaches inside and he gets attacked and slowly and violently pulled inside as Stanley flees. Stanley grabs a student named Charlie for help, but when they get back, a blood trail leads back under the stairs. Charlie investigates and is also attacked by a scary, ape-like creature. After a fighting couple run afoul of the beast, the husband, Henry, feeds his wife to it. Later, Stanley and Henry work together to dump the crate into the ocean after resealing it. The fourth story, called Something to Tide You Over, begins with a man named Richard as he buries a man named Harry up to his head on a beach as the tide rolls in. Then he sets up a TV to show Harry Richard's wife, Becky, who is buried elsewhere, also on the beach. Richard reveals that he knows they were having an affair, then he just leaves and watches as they both slowly drown. Later, Harry and Becky, both risen from the dead, attack Richard in his home before taking him and burying him on the beach up to his head as the tide rolls in. The fifth story, called They're Creeping Up on You, begins with Upson Pratt, a cruel business mogul who suffers from misophobia, who has holed himself up in his home. After Pratt takes a work call and he takes delight in the death of a rival, he starts seeing cockroaches all over his usually uber-clean home. As he discovers more and more roaches, he tries to escape into his panic room, but he finds a roach swarm already inside, causing him to have a heart attack. Later, when his body is found, it's now bloated with cockroaches inside. So that's it. That's the comic adaptation of the original CREEPSHOW film. Stay tuned for the recent comics revival.